Hello, everyone. It is Oliver G here. You're listening to the Earful Tower podcast. And why am I speaking so quickly? Because I'm excited. And why am I excited? Because it's my birthday today. And I'm pre-recording this a couple days before. But the reason I'm excited now while I'm recording it is because my birthday is traditionally a huge day in the G household. If you've read my book, you'll know that when I turned 30, or maybe I shouldn't spoil it, but when I turned 30, Lena, my wife, got me a red vehicle as a surprise. I won't spoil it, but a red two-wheeled vehicle. And the same year, I rented a chateau for my birthday, also in the book. So who knows what's going to happen for this big birthday, or if indeed it'll just be a regular one. But hey, look, I'm excited. So let's keep that excitement going for this great episode. Today, we've got one of my favorite guests. It's Boris Petrovic he's from Paris in person. He does tour guides. He knows absolutely everything. I tried to rebrand him as Boris the Brain, but I'm not sure that he was so keen on it, but I like it. Boris the Brain. He runs a tour company. He really, honestly can answer any Paris question, and that's why I love having him on the show. So I was chatting with him, and I said... I'll tell you why I got the idea for this episode. I'd seen that Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, has been pushing for more and more bicycle lanes in the city of Paris. And they seem to be just popping up like daisies. Daisies, I guess, if you like them, like weeds if you don't like them. But it got me thinking, Paris has always been a city for walkers, a walking city for the flaneur or the flaneurs. And it made me think, does that mean it's going to change? So I called Boris up. I said, hey, what do you know about walking? The past, the present, the future of walking in Paris. And obviously, Boris had a lot to say. So what you're going to hear is him walking us through the 3 ages of walking in Paris. Back in the medieval times, the Haussmannian age, which he'll explain obviously, and then the future and how it's likely to change. He recorded his part of this while he was literally walking through Paris. And we were doing it on Zoom so I could see what he was looking at, and he was going around the Eiffel Tower. So you'll hear he was like on those gravelly footpaths that go around the Eiffel Tower in the 7th arrondissement where he lives. So you'll hear the crunch of gravel under his feet, you'll hear people walking by, maybe you'll feel like you're in Paris. So anyway, Boris from Paris in person, check him out, book a tour with him next time you come to Paris. As for me and my birthday, I'd like to give you a present. So if you go on the EiffelTower.com/birthday, I have done a ridiculously generous discount on my book and audio package. So now's a really good time to buy it for yourself or for your friend, or get the audio if you haven't heard it already. It's a lot cheaper just for 24 hours to celebrate my birthday if you've already got it, or if maybe you want to give me a birthday present, a win-win birthday present for us both, sign up on Patreon. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can become a member for a whole year now, and you get 2 months off. Or you can just sign up every month. Patreon.com/The Earful Tower. But let's get into it. Boris Petrovic, Paris in person, walking in Paris. And remember, hang around at the end. I'll read out a little bit of Gmail. But let's get into it. Let's do it. So, Boris, you're out walking in the streets of Paris. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well, loud and clear.
We're making history here. You're walking with a mask on in the 7th arrondissement while recording an Eiffel Tower podcast episode. Who would have thought this is where we'd be?
Yeah, just last year, you would not see any of this happening.
How does it feel?
On a kind of more than one reason.
I can see the Eiffel Tower over your shoulder, by the way. Literally, if you go back 3 steps, see it? So tell us where you are.
Well, I'm at the very entrance to the Champ de Mars. So I was thinking that's the park at the foot of the Eiffel Tower. So if you remember our Art Nouveau Eiffel Tower episode, that's where we started it. And then we continued, visiting all these beautiful Art Nouveau buildings. So behind me now is École Militaire. I don't know if you can see it. And straight in front is the old tower itself.
Right, okay.
As you can see, the park is beautifully empty. This is a joy to behold.
Well, let's talk about that for a second before we get into walking, which is what you're doing and the topic of the day. Can you give me a glimpse into what daily life in Paris looks like now, mid-September?
Well, it's la rentrée, as they call it here. So kids are going back to school. And city is on one end very busy, like cafes are, stacked with people, and seen from the outside, you could say that no one really cares about the pandemic. No one really respects the rules, more or less. So the government is still debating, if they should impose another shutdown, but they are aware that that would kill the economy. So they don't really want to do it, but they may have to do it because the numbers are soaring. So it's just this strange atmosphere where people are either ignoring all the precautions that we should be taking, or they're just in panic mode and they're anticipating the apocalypse, so somewhere in between those two things.
Wow. Okay.
But,
I think speaking of extremes, I think we'll go the opposite direction of the apocalypse and give everyone a nice distraction. Is that a crow?
Yes, that is a crow, yes.
Jeez, that was a little bit apocalyptic as well.
There you go, yeah.
Let's go the opposite direction. So for the next half an hour, everyone can escape to Paris with Boris. You can even hear the gravel crunching under your feet in that beautiful
amazing sound effects.
Yeah. So let's talk about it. Walking, the topic of the day. A lot of people say that Paris is a city that's built for walking. And when I sort of started chatting with you about this, you said, well, this is nothing new. In fact, you said it's like, there are 3 levels of it. Can you talk me through the levels and then maybe we can explore it deeper?
Okay, yeah. Well, initially, when we were talking about the very beginnings of Paris, it was not at all made for walking. It was a very different city to begin with. So the 3 levels that we were discussing were medieval Paris, the Industrial Revolution Paris, so you might say the Paris of the 19th century and of the Haussmannian reconstruction, and the Paris of today. So I was thinking of addressing the topic of walking through those 3 major eras of the city. Now, the first thing to understand when we're talking about the medieval period and walking in Paris is that Paris, for most of it, was not paved. So the city was basically a giant puddle of mud.
When you say medieval period, when exactly are we talking?
Well, it kind of depends if you're talking about, the Dark Ages, the early medieval or the high medieval period. But you might say, grosso modo, it's anywhere between 6th century to late 15th century AD. But the period that I'm addressing, when Paris is, becoming the capital of France and is becoming the cultural powerhouse, is anywhere between the late 11th century and, late 15th. So that's kind of the medieval frame that we'll be addressing.
Okay.
And yeah, the fact that Paris was not paved actually stretches after the medieval period. The first time when Paris were more or less fully paved was indeed the very end of the 18th century. And when it was completely paved was the Haussmannian reconstruction. So for most of its history, Paris didn't really have cobbled streets, didn't really have asphalt streets. It was just mud roads, right? Now, as you can imagine, this makes for a very different walking experience. And you can say that those mud roads were not really created for walking to begin with. So it was really created for carriages and horses. So you could say that walking in medieval period was a fairly dangerous business because the center of the city was always congested, very crowded, very noisy, very smelly. And, you would always run a risk of being run over by a carriage or by a horse. You would run a risk of being gored by a runaway pig, which is a thing that actually happened a lot in Paris and most of medieval cities, really, that, people would bring their animals to sell them, and then those animals would escape, and then they would wreak havoc on the city. So a pedestrian in medieval period would have to be careful, not only for mud, but also for runaway animals. Now, these were not only domestic animals that were terrorizing the pedestrians of Paris. There's a very famous incident, the wolf raid on the city of Paris, that took place in the middle of the 15th century, so 1450, where a pack of starved wolves attacked the city of Paris and killed 40 inhabitants. Now, as you can imagine,
what?
Yeah, you can Google this. This is a true historic fact. That what basically happened in the 15th century was that the country was starved on account of the 100 Years' War. So all of the farms and all of the granaries were strained maximally, and people were forced to hunt in the forests, to supplement their diet. So they basically exterminated all of the animals from the forest, animals like boars, deer, etc. So wolves still living in the forests around Paris had nothing to eat, right? And so the only thing that they could do was attack farms and the city of Paris itself. So you had this massive pack of starved wolves that went through the ramparts of the city of Paris and started, rampaging at the very center of the city. So before the citizens were able to organize themselves and to basically, slaughter every last one of these wolves, they killed around 40 people.
Wow.
So yeah, this is this is another thing that happened in medieval Paris. Another pedestrian experience, and just like a very different idea of urban living. Back in the day.
So it doesn't sound
Something
to me.
we kind of.
So it doesn't sound to me like a very good city to walk around in 1450 at least.
No, not really. No, that was possibly the worst time to be walking around the city of Paris. Now, there is another thing to address when walking, as the topic of conversation, is that the walking itself was very different. In the European medieval period, people had very different shoes with very, very thin soles. So you might say that the shoe was actually very different from the shoes that we wear today, because our soles are quite rugged. And therefore, when we walk, we tend to put our foot in such a way that we don't hit the ground with fingers, but we hit it with the heel of our feet, right? So you kind of have this rolling movement. Well, back in the day, seeing how the soles of shoes were very fine and very, I would say, offered no protection, people would walk in a manner where they would put their finger first.
So they walked their toe first.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, the toe. That's what I wanted to say. So they kind of walked like ballet dancers. This whole idea that if you put your toe first, you can inspect the ground that you're treading, and you can see, if there's some hidden, a glass or metal, or a splinter or whatever in the mud in front of you. And if there is something like that, you can jump back more easily than if you put your heel first. So you could say that the very walking was different, on account of the non-paved streets and on account of different shoe quality. And it's only then in the 15th century that people started using shoes that somewhat resemble, shoes that we have today, and that are actually sturdy enough that you don't really have to think about the soil you're treading upon. So, even if you step on a nail today, it's likely not going to pierce your shoe. Well, back in the day, it would cause serious damage. So you could say that that's another reason why Paris of the medieval period was not necessarily the best of places to be walking around.
Right. Wow.
It would give you killer calves, though. Like you would really,
So am I right? I'm no expert on Paris history, but is it true that the sort of creation of the sidewalks and the gas lamps changed everything?
Well, Ollie, by now you are sort of an expert for that's the first thing to be remarked. The other one is, yes, gas lamps indeed changed a lot because city was better illuminated. And so there were far less dangers of you being sacked or killed or, otherwise taken advantage of in dark alleys. So that really did contribute a lot, because you can imagine the difference between the Paris of the, let's say, 14th century, where there were entirely 3 lamps in the entire city, right? Like a total of 3 like night lights. And what we have today, Paris being the city of lights, Paris being the most illuminated place in the world. Now, what really happened with the Haussmannian intervention is that we had several different reasons of why people built the city as it was, a pedestrian city. So why we started having sidewalks and why we started having, these really large avenues and boulevards. So we can go into these now, and they all revolve around walking more or less, right? They all revolve around this idea that you spend your time outside. So you could say that the first reason, and the most obvious one, was hygienic, right? Before the intervention, Paris was a cesspool So it was basically a breeding ground of cholera and of tuberculosis. And there were very, very often outbreaks of these two deadly pandemics. So there was this idea of a city that was extremely lacking in hygiene. A lot of people lived in very small, cramped spaces, which is kind of still the case today. But most importantly, streets were very narrow and houses were stacked one next to another. So these airborne diseases, were had a very easy job of spreading. The idea was if you create a very wide street, that leaves a lot of space for the wind to blow through and basically disperse all these aerosols that carry airborne diseases. So it was, you might say, hygienic, right? For air to be better ventilated, for wind to provide natural ventilation. So, and also next to that, separating houses, or at least separating the houses in the street, so that if a fire happens, it would not get across to the other side of the street. So that was also a safety measure. Now, next to that, there was this entire idea that most of your listeners are probably already familiar with, of a flaneur, which is a French term of a walker, someone who enjoys the city, right, a urban explorer in a way, but most of all, someone who is a leisurely gentleman of means, who has enough free time to just allow himself to spend the day walking, browsing windows, checking other people out, commenting on what they wear. Like a flaneur is someone who takes great pride in his, well, not to say boredom, but opulence of free time, you might say. So in order for you to do that, of course, you have to have, streets where you can walk in. And you have to have a city that is entirely designed for a pedestrian. Now, this all has to do, with economic forces behind the city of Paris and the nascent industrial capitalism and the nascent consumer society, right? The idea was that if you're walking around the city, you have all these windows that are created to attract your attention and to make you buy stuff. Mm-hmm. So especially when you're walking around the 9th district, the Opera House and the Galerie Lafayette and all that place, you see that all of those buildings were indeed designed to have windows and to have businesses on the ground floor. And this is one very interesting thing, when you're comparing urbanscape of city of Paris and of many American cities. You can see how different economic interests shaped those cities in very different fashions. So, for example, what you have in the States is the fact that oil interest really created the cityscape of most American cities. You have the downtown where people go to work, and then you have the suburbs where people live. So in order for you to move between the suburbs and the city, you have to have your own car, right? So when you drive your car, that benefits whoever's selling the oil. So you could say that the American cities are built around that premise. Whereas here in the city of Paris, houses were made in such a way that you would not have these so-called urban deserts. When, for example, in an American city, everyone goes home for weekend, the center of the city grows desert, like there's no one there, So this is what people wanted to avoid in Paris. So they created Haussmannian buildings where you have windows and businesses on the ground floor with their, great windows that you can browse as you're walking. And then they have housing quarters, apartments on the upper floors. So, you have a building that the ground floor is commercial, then perhaps offices are on the first or the second floor, and then apartments are on the third, fourth, and fifth floor. So you kind of have all rolled into one. And that creates, again, a very different experience of living in a city and, of course, walking in a city.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions for you. First, I'm going to come back to Haussmann, but where you're standing now is right by the Eiffel Tower, right?
Yep, that's true.
You personally, did you look up at it as you walked past? Because you didn't show it on the camera, and I'm wondering if that's because you live next door and you're sick of it.
Yeah, I'm just like, whatever. It's this is where I come to run like thrice a week. So but yeah, I should probably be more aware of its presence.
It's kind of amazing also, for the people at home who are just listening to this. Boris, in the past 5 minutes, has walked right next to the Eiffel Tower, and didn't even seem to glance up at it. Sort of kept it right off to the side of the camera without even, and only now is acknowledging its presence. That's a true
Yeah.
Parisian. But that's not what I wanted to say. I wanted to ask, there are probably a lot of people who maybe haven't even heard this word Haussmann before.
Hmm.
Can you explain like what sort of percentage of Parisian buildings are Haussmannian and what do they look like?
Well, you could say that when Haussmann made his intervention, he basically destroyed 70% of the city of Paris. So that gives you the idea of the percentage of buildings that are considered Haussmannian nowadays. Now, I wouldn't say it's 70% today because, of course, Paris had other buildings made, since the intervention up to today. But I would say it's fairly close. I would venture a guess around 60%, perhaps even 65.
Mm-hmm.
So really, most of the city that you can see nowadays is Haussmannian. I mean, this entire row of houses that you can see in front of me is a perfect illustration of Haussmannian architecture.
Right.
So, all of the houses being in one line, very orderly, very imposing, very solid, made to look as if they're made of stone, although they are not. They're made of brick and mortar with an artificial stone facade. But they're meant to convey this idea of strong presence.
Wow.
So another reason why Haussmannian intervention is so important for pedestrian life, and what gives us a better glimpse into the 19th century, is the actually most important reason why streets of Paris were made the way they are, why they're so wide, and why they are cobbled. So why it was so important to pave the entirety of the city. And this is the fact that the 19th century in Paris was extremely turbulent political era. So you could say that it was the era of unfettered, unrestrained, completely unregulated industrial production, capitalistic production, which meant that people worked and lived in horrendous conditions. And this meant that people often protested. So protests upon protests happened in the city of Paris, as they do now, as you're well aware of, but I would say far less violent protests happen today. What happened back in the day was really, really gruesome. So dozens of people dying by protest. So this became such an issue for the government that they've installed really wide avenues and really wide boulevards and streets wide enough so they could take the military out, and wide enough so that the military could employ cannons that they could then use to fire at protesters. So you could say that, for all the beauty of Parisian Haussmannian streets, for all the charm and romanticism behind the idea of a flaneur, there is this fairly dark original reasons why we have cobbled streets and why we have paved streets and why we have these really large and wide avenues and boulevards.
Wow, Boris! You've blown my mind.
Well, thank you, Oliver. That's a mind-blowing piece of info, yeah, per se.
I'm particularly fascinated by Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in the city that as far as I know, had the first sidewalks on it in the city or the country, maybe. Is that true? And was it as important as I understand it to be?
Yeah, it is true. It's funnily enough, you should mention that the Pont Neuf, which in French means the new bridge, is the oldest existing bridge in the city. The first bridge entirely made of stone, so over 400 years old. And yes, it did have this space for pedestrians, and it did have a space that was occupied by dentists. So they've banned the practice after a couple of years because it was too gruesome. The entire bridge basically smelled of blood and of alcohol. I mean, alcohol because that's what people used as anesthetics, and blood because most of the entire dental practice back in the day was pulling teeth out. So, this beautiful stone bridge was very soon covered, in discarded teeth, blood, and spilled alcohol. So it didn't really help.
Why did they have dentists? Why were there dentists on Pont Neuf?
Well, it was just a thing, back in the day, you would practice whatever you practiced out in the streets. If you didn't have the money to buy yourself an ordination, to, have actual quarters where you would practice your dental work, you would just do it in the street, so.
Wow.
You might say that people saw dentistry back in the day as they see, food selling today, so
It's
just
it's
something
funny.
you do on the street.
It's funny, Boris, because both you and I make our living still often out on the street. So some things,
Yeah, we're
some.
street urchins.
Let's talk about the third level of walking in Paris, which brings us more towards today.
Sorry,
And
would you say that we have street cred? Could that be like applied?
I don't think either of us have street cred, Boris, and you know
Okay, so back to the third level. Yeah.
that.
Well,
Back to the hang on. Back to the third level, and for people who like to imagine at home, Boris is on the paved roads now, walking away from the Eiffel Tower towards the École Militaire.
École Militaire. That's right.
Very quiet.
It is. Yeah, perfect autumn day here.
Yeah.
So yeah, fairly quiet. Back to the third section of this short impromptu history of walking in Paris is the Paris of today, where pedestrians once again are, I might dare to say, being pushed to the side because the current mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, fairly controversial figure, is trying to optimize this city for bike riders. And this is something that everyone living in Paris had noticed, that first of all, traffic in Paris is absolutely horrendous. Now, you may argue that it's similar with all the other major, metropolitan cities, but, again, you may argue that it's actually worse than any of that. So this is especially true because Paris, before the COVID pandemics, was a very, very touristy city. So in these tourist season months, you would have a lot of people, taking bus tours, taking private car tours. I mean, I gave a lot of those tours myself. So traffic is extremely congested. Now, the controversial thing that Anne Hidalgo was doing was cutting down on all of the roads and all of the paths, for pedestrians and for cars equally, and turning them into bike lanes. So some previously very wide streets, like let's say Rue de Rivoli, a very famously wide street, was narrowed down to only 2 lanes because 3 lanes are for bikes now, and 2 lanes are only for cars. So, you could say that these bike paths are taking space, from not only cars, but also pedestrians. Now, I personally don't mind. I mean, as I ride a bike myself, I think that's a, solid idea. But I can see the controversy, of basically cutting down the street size in an already extremely congested city.
So what does that mean then, Boris? Does it mean that Paris isn't going to be a city for flaneurs and flaneuses anymore?
Yes, I think that's the implication, right? That this is a city that it's ever so slowly catching up with time, and it's losing this pedestrian vibe. First of all, I would say that for a while now, Paris has been a very hectic place. Very few people that live here actually have the time to just, browse windows through the city or walk around aimlessly, as beautiful as that may be. So Paris has lost this, I would say, and it has been losing this aura of flaneur for a couple of decades now, and is turning itself into a modern metropolis. So one way of seeing this is the famous, Paris 2023 plan, where they will, for the first time since the Haussmannian intervention, expand the city of Paris and include the suburbs into it. So the suburbs are going to become the city of Paris too. Now, this is important for walkers and for the idea of Paris as a pedestrian city because it will largely dilute this entire situation. Most of the suburbs are not designed for walking the way that Paris is. So, if you include all of that into the city of Paris, then Paris is not really a pedestrian city anymore. It kind of looks like most other cities do. You could say that the center of it is still more or less pedestrian, but not the entirety of the city. So, yeah.
Wow, it sounds
that's kind
like
of the dilution of that.
I wonder if it's mostly tourists who are being the flaneurs nowadays in Paris.
Well, yes and no. It kind of depends on the perspective. So if you have like a small group, as the ones I prefer doing, and I mostly do, I would say that yes, you can walk from Notre Dame to the Eiffel Tower or any other, two landmarks that you want, and you can take your time, stroll around leisurely and talk about the city. So that's one way of doing it. And the other way of doing it that it's becoming increasingly popular are these really big buses that carry, 50 to 100 people that block around traffic. So they come to a certain place, they unload a bunch of people, then they take photos. They make a lot of noise in a really large crowd, and then they go back into the bus. So, I mean, I've done bus tours too. It's not, nearly as charming, I would say, as just walking, So this was the tendency that people started noticing and started complaining about. Then they actually started a petition of banning those buses in the center of the city, which hopefully will come to pass, that we won't have to deal with them anymore.
Especially up where I live in Montmartre, Pigalle, the roads are so narrow there that when the buses are all parked up there, it just clogs up the whole village, basically.
Yeah, but people still try to run buses through, what is essentially a former village, of Montmartre, as you know. So that's why they're trying to ban them. So it's like this, idea that Paris should be the city of bike drivers, bicycles, and to a certain extent pedestrians. And, another scourge of pedestrians in Paris, and most people will relate to this, are electric scooters, right? Trottinettes, as they call them here. So you could say that a scooter is something that is equally seen on the pavement and on the road itself, So it's this like gray area that you can actually ride them on a pavement, but you can also ride them on the road. And if you ride them on the pavement and the sidewalk, it's pretty bothersome for all the pedestrians, for all the flaneurs.
Especially because people can't seem to park them very well.
Yeah, not really, no. And they mostly end up in the Seine, I mean, it creates a strange situation because most people walking in Paris nowadays, as well as in any other European city, are not browsing the buildings. They're not looking at each other. They're looking at their phones. So, it's like you see a bunch of people on scooters hitting up a bunch of people, who are looking at their phones rather than when they're walking. So, I mean, some of these situations are funny. Some are just plain annoying, So you might say that the future of Paris is half electric scooters, half pedestrians, half bikes. Well, actually, third scooters, third bikes, third pedestrians.
Oh, yikes. Well, let's maybe we could sort of round things up now, but I'm interested to hear on a sort of closing note, besides the obvious fact that when people finally come back to Paris, that they'll book a tour with you at Paris in person. Are you standing on Rue de Belgrade there?
That is beyond obvious.
Yeah.
Exactly, yes. This is the street dedicated to my home city, yeah. So,
are you from Belgrade? Is that where you're from, in Serbia?
By accident, this is where we end up.
Wow.
Yeah, that's where I'm from, yeah, Belgrade. So here we have the Belgrade street of Paris.
That's a fitting place to end, but can you end by telling us a little bit about what it's like as a tour guide in Paris right now? Are you struggling as much as I can imagine you might be?
Oh yeah, fairly. I mean, well, what I'm trying to do now is to give Zoom tours. So just, me walking around the city and basically doing what I'm doing with you now. So, I'm showing things to people, I'm talking about them, and then they ask me questions on Zoom. So I think there's a certain potential in that, so I just need to kind of build that entire business model and explain to people that they can also do a Zoom tour. They don't have to physically be present in Paris. We can do this virtually. And then to adapt, the things I talk about and how I explain to this particular format. So I think that currently that's my focus. And I'm thinking that's going to become a fairly important part of tourism even when the COVID pandemic ends, Just this possibility that you can visit a city while still lying on your couch.
Yeah.
And, you can have live contact with the guide and all of it. So, we're kind of slowly shifting things in that direction.
So, what's the best place that people can follow you to keep an eye on you for this kind of stuff?
Well, there's my Instagram profile. There's a Facebook profile. I mean, there's our site, obviously, parisinperson.com. So one of these days I should put like a special page on my site dedicated to Zoom tours. And that's, and of course, they can always write me to book at parisinperson.com and schedule these tours in person. And we can work it out from there.
Cool. And as you know very well, Boris, the listeners of the Eiffel Tower are huge fans of you, and everyone always requests that you come on the show. So I'm sure people will track you down. But thanks for giving me this walking tour today. It's been really nice to see around Paris with you.
Well, thanks, Ollie. You know that I'm a fan of your listeners too. I enjoy their questions, and I befriended some of them on Facebook. So always happy to continue doing that.
Great.
So yeah.
Great.
Let me just turn the camera around real quick so I can say hi to my niece again. Ciao, Nero, opet. And we can perhaps end on that note. If you have so many other questions or you think we're good.
I'll just save them for the next time I have you on the show. It's always a pleasure, Boris. Thank you so much.
Oh, likewise. Keep in touch. Ciao.
Ciao.
All right, so there you have it. That was Boris Petrovic. Check him out, Paris in person. You can find him on, well, as he said, Instagram, Facebook. I think if you add him as a friend on Facebook, he'll even accept you. Get into his world. Check him out. He really does know his stuff. If you're a Patreon member, Eddie, the editor of this show, has put together a really beautiful scroll with everything. I've read it already. Everything that Boris mentioned. So links about those wolves. There's information about the shoes and pictures. There's links to other stuff I've done with Boris. It's all there. If you're on Patreon, it's already published. If you're not, now's the time to check it out. But I thought I'd read out just a little bit of an email or two from you guys before we round things out. So these emails I'm looking at now, these are what people have sent through from just the contact form on my website, which you can do too, theeiffeltower.com. So this comes in from Remy. He says, your podcasts, Oliver, have kept me sane. I'm a CPA, a certified public accountant, and with the pandemic, our tax season has extended well into the summer. I'm sorry to hear that, Remy. That doesn't sound like fun work, perhaps. Maybe it is. Hey, we were considered critical workers, believe it or not, and while not critical in the sense of healthcare workers and first responders, we were necessary to keep payroll processing, tax refunds coming, and assist with loan and grant applications. It goes on a little bit with a bit of in California, fires, yes, terrible stuff here, but I've so enjoyed my mental vacations to Paris with you and Lena, sitting at my desk. I was fortunate to visit Paris a few years ago, truly a dream come true, and your vivid descriptions take me back. I feel as I'm sitting with you and your guests, sharing a casual conversation, exchanging friendly stories, and enjoying a common passion, Paris. Now this bit's interesting. Remy says, while I know you spend a great deal of time preparing, researching, and coordinating each episode, do I? You make them seem so effortless. You've kept me sane, and I feel that I've gained new friends in you, Lena, and Eddie. There you go, Eddie. I so loved the story of poor little Eddie nearly having to sleep on a Paris park bench had it not been for Mary. I'm reading your book and find it equally entertaining, and I look forward to your stories from Sweden in your new podcast. You and Lena are both very talented. Eddie, too. Many, many thanks. Well, thanks to you, Remy. Eddie, you must be enjoying that one. You got it. Did you write this one, Eddie? Thanks, Remy. That's a really kind thing for you to send in, and to address a few of the things that you've mentioned there. I think if anyone out there is a new listener, he's referring to my first trip to Paris with my little brother Eddie when we got. Well, I won't give away the story, but you should go and listen to that episode next. And as for the Sweden podcast, I'm glad you brought that up. That's still unconfirmed if I'll do a Sweden podcast. The only thing that's for sure right now is that there's an Instagram page, The Earful Sweden, that has 700 or 800 followers right now. And if you want a little bit of Sweden on your feed, go and check that out. But thanks, Remy, for that email. I'll read one more. Let's have a look here. This next one is from Sandra Carter, and she says, I just listened to the recent podcast, 10 Weird Habits of Swedish People, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. Wichita, how exotic. And I wonder if other people in America think that's exotic, as I do. Wichita. It's from a song, isn't it? Wichita Lines, man? Yeah. Anyway, exotic old Wichita. Here we go. As a child, I went on a field trip to Lindsborg in Kansas, known as Little Sweden. Fun fact, that would be pronounced Lindsborg. It's a beautiful little town with a great Swedish heritage. I've not been back in many, many years, but your show made me want to visit there again. That is probably as close as I'll ever get to Sweden, unfortunately. Oh, well, who knows, Sandra Carter? Maybe you'll make it to Sweden one day. I hope you do. It's a beautiful country. In fact, I got a lot of emails after that Swedish episode with people talking about the Swedish influence in America. And apparently in Minnesota, there's a big bunch of Sweden stuff. And it reminded me that Lena and I actually went on a big US road trip to a town called New Sweden, just outside of Austin, Texas. And I did a little Instagram story about it on the Earful Sweden. But anyway, listen, that's enough. That's enough for today. I love it when the emails come in. Keep sending them. Thanks for sending them. Thanks for your support, everybody. And I think I'm going to go and enjoy the rest of my birthday. Don't forget, theearfultower.com/birthday if you want to get some treats for yourself or sign up and support the show. Otherwise, I'll be back again next week with an episode with New York Times best-selling author Cara Black, who's got a new book out that's set in World War II in Paris. We'll be talking all about that. I think you're going to like that episode. As for me, time to enjoy that birthday. Talk to you guys soon. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
I don't really know where we are. I just